Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, the webinar today on the 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and how we can engage African business in support of this initiative and creating a nature positive economy. We have a quite tight agenda today, a number of speakers lined up for you who will give brief presentations clustered around 3 themes. At the end of each theme, a moderator for the theme will field a few questions. So if you do have questions as the participants speak, please feel free to put them into the chat box, and we will put them to the appropriate person at the end of that theme. If we can ask that you keep your system on mute and your video camera off until such time as you speak. For the presenters, for the audience, probably easier in terms of bandwidth and Wi-Fi if you keep your cameras off. But welcome everybody. We're just waiting for 1 or 2 more people to join back in. We lost one of the speakers a few seconds ago, so we'll get him back in, and then we'll get going. My name is Karen Ayerton. I'm going to be moderating or hosting this session today. I'm an independent sustainability consultant and one of the trustees of the Endangered Wildlife Trust. Very excited to have this opportunity to participate in today's workshop and look forward to hearing the diverse views that we will hear today from a healthy mixture of NGO, business, and others, all speaking around how we create this desired future of a nature positive economy and support and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. As I said earlier, we're just waiting for 1 or 2 speakers to come back in. They kind of got dropped out in terms of Wi-Fi linkage. So once we confirm that they're in, we will get going. And I think I see that Francis Ogwal is back in. Francis is the co-chair of the Convention on Biodiversity, in particular for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So welcome, Francis. We look forward to what you have to say. Over to you. If you can unmute yourself and perhaps put your camera on. Francis, are we able to pick you up? Okay, let's see if somebody can get Francis up on a... Francis, can you put yourself off mute? And okay, we seem to have a problem with Francis. Let's give it a minute or 2. My apologies. When you've got as big a group of people as this, we are expecting a large audience today. This can be a bit of a challenge. Gabby, are you able to get hold of Francis and check what the problem is? So in terms of lineup, while we're waiting for Francis to connect, in terms of the lineup for today, the first theme that we're going to discuss will be moderated by Justin Smith of WWF, a well-known figure in this field. And the topic is why addressing nature loss is such an urgent issue for African business and what are businesses doing about it. In this theme, we'll hear from the Group Head of Sustainability for Woolworths. For those of you who don't know Woolworths, it's a retail chain in South Africa, which has taken a lead in many biodiversity and agriculturally appropriate supply chain issues. We'll hear from Gabby Terran, Program Manager for the National Biodiversity and Business Network. I'm sure you all know Gabby. Michael Keogh, Manager of Environment and Climate Change in SAFRICOM, and Hlengiwe Ndlovu, Divisional Environmental Manager of SAPI. In the second theme, we'll touch on what is needed in the CBD post-2020 framework to enable active business contribution. And our panel moderator will be Michael Ofoshini-Wise from Business for Nature. Thank you, Michael. And the third theme, final theme for today, will be moderated by Candace Stevens, Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition. And this will be about unlocking finance. So let's see, is Francis back in and able to speak? Gabby, can you give us a cue as to whether, okay, so we've got a bit of a challenge. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go into the first theme. I'm going to hand over to Justin to introduce the speakers very briefly, and then each speaker will give a 5-minute opening comment, and we'll have a very brief question and answer session at the end of the theme. Thank you, Justin.
Thanks so much, Karen. Yeah, I think really exciting that we've got such a diversified business audience to give a little bit of their input around why nature and biodiversity that is encompassed is so critical for our kind of value chains and for a lot of the economy in Africa as well. So I think our first speaker is Feroz Kaur, who's the Group Head of Sustainability for Woolworths Holdings. As you were saying, it's one of our big diversified retail chains operating across South Africa and much of Southern Africa as well. And within both the food and textile side, it's always been a really interesting kind of learning space around commodity sourcing and other great practices. So looking forward to hear from Feroz in terms of the latest work Woolies has been doing.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation today. We're really honored to be here with such a great variety of speakers and also the participants, not just talking to business, which we normally do, but talking to NGOs, other public sector organizations, and so on a topic which I think is so important, but is very difficult to grasp, especially in the corporate world. And I think it's a good question around, what's the case for biodiversity or approaching biodiversity in the corporate world. So I'm just going to give a little bit of some thoughts from our side. We business people, we're not experts in this space, but what it means for us and how we tend to approach it. And also how we try and translate it into language that people understand, because as I'll talk about later, but we've just gone through a process of reviewing and revising our sustainability strategy for the next 5 years and beyond. And one of the areas of focus that, or material areas of focus that we reiterated was biodiversity. And that's the one that, people tend to nod their heads and say, oh, that sounds important, but nobody understands it. And it's how do we translate that internally? And so I think the case for, understanding this is there. We know the issue of, the impact or what's happening globally around declining populations, many species facing extinction. We've heard of talk of the sixth mass extinction. A sense of, if you're reading the popular media, and oftentimes you talk about diversity, you're reading specialist publications, you're talking at forums like this, but ask many people who just read popular media, and they'll know about declining bee populations globally, for example. And what does that mean for, firstly, just the fact that we have a loss of bees, but what does it mean, and what is the impact of that on society globally? And I think once we start making those connections, we start appreciating, well, biodiversity is so important And it's fundamental to our existence as individuals, but as organizations as well. And I think that's the starting point for us, is kind of getting a sense of what's our role in all of this. How does, where do we play in this broad ecosystem of, and how does what we do impact on global biodiversity, and how does what's happening in global biodiversity impact on us? And it's about appreciating that, understanding that we're not insulated from this. We've got massive supply chains locally and globally. There's just so many things happening in the world, and trying to get the business to understand that while these concepts are maybe nobody's meant to be an expert in it internally necessarily, but how do we guide ourselves through that so we can understand, as I said, the impacts on us and our impacts on that. As a food and clothing or apparel retailer, a lot of what we do relies on agriculture. And so what is the impact of and we know what the role of commercial agriculture globally is: the use of land, clearing of virgin forests, the use of inputs that are harmful to soil, insects, water. So how is what we're doing, even if we're not intentionally doing it, how does it contribute to this? And are we understanding those impacts? Are we understanding the complexity in those supply chains? And then there's obviously increasing pressure coming from society, from NGOs, from customers. Customers want to know what's going on. Where does my product come from? They want to understand traceability, supply chain transparency. We've got increasing reporting obligations, which sometimes tend to slow down the ability to do things, but are very valuable because they force one to shine a light on what you're doing. So we know about the Task Force for Nature-Based Disclosures. There's the Science-Based Targets initiative. There's just so much going on out there. The JSE is tomorrow has a seminar on their new climate disclosure requirements for listed entities, and all of these are interrelated, and takes me to my next point. So one is we need to understand it. We need to understand what's going on. First, acknowledge and appreciate that we're not immune to anything. We're not an island. We impact the world impacts us. What we do has consequences. And then two is also understanding that all of these things are interrelated. What I mean by that is, in going through the strategy process I mentioned, we articulated what are the key material things we have to look at. Climate change obviously comes up above everything else. It's just so overarching. And in fact, my view is a lot of what we're talking about are subsets of climate change, whether we're talking about water or biodiversity loss and so on. But if you want to treat them as separate just to allow us to manage them, they're all interrelated, right? And so what we also try to do is translate this into business language. Get the business to understand that biodiversity loss in business language means potentially impacts on quality and availability of product, impact on supply chain disruptions, inability to source product from areas that you're potentially sourcing from, the need to find new suppliers, impact on customer sentiment, where people tend to spend their money, or how they want to spend, what type of products they want to source or they want to purchase, how they want to use their buying power. Impact on product delay coming to market, and the ability to access finance. If you're not an organization that is taking this seriously, is not understanding the impacts of these kind of things. So it truly plays into the genuine sustainability of organizations, in the sense that, are you going to be here in 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years time if you're not aware, one, of these kind of things, and just beyond awareness, you are not doing, or you're not embedding this in your operations so that you can actively manage and avoid risk. I mean, if you have to come to bring it down to a basic level for businesses, a lot of it is about risk management as well. So it's about understanding, translating it into languages, into language that the business understands. And then in the space, I think you mentioned that we've been doing things for a while in the space we have. I mentioned we've re-articulated our goals to 2025 and beyond. We're calling this Vision 2025 Plus, allowing us to look to 2025 and beyond. We've set a science-based target for climate. We've set renewable energy targets, net zero targets, but we've also set targets around agriculture. And we've been very active in the space for a long time. Our Farming for the Future program, which you're very, very familiar with, is over 10 years old. I think it's entering its 12th year now. And I think it has been a groundbreaking initiative from a corporate perspective to look at farming and understanding the value chain end to end, and essentially if you're to bring it down to what is farming for the future about, it's about the health of the soil. And the soil health is impacted by everything we do around it. And the things we do around it impact biodiversity. So how nutritious is the soil, and what are the things that feed into that to ensure that we can produce high quality products with the least harmful impact on the environment. In so doing, we've improved farmers' yields while reducing all types of inputs, even water. I mean, farmers on our program are more water efficient and so on. And it's about understanding of why is this important, and are we willing to put the effort behind doing what needs to be done. We've, there's the term that's become a bit in vogue now, regenerative agriculture. I think it's a great term. What does it mean though? And we can fit farming for the future under that and say we've been doing this for a long time, but it's about giving back, right? About regenerating the natural ecosystems. Sourcing, I mentioned commodity sourcing, traceability, working with multi-stakeholder programs and organizations globally, whether it's RSPO for palm oil, Better Cotton, the FSC for forest products, and there's just so many others. But it's also about us working with other organizations and like-minded companies in order to work collectively to address these issues, because we appreciate that these are issues that are bigger than us individually and require collective action. And then we've got work along the lines of our water balance and water stewardship work we're doing with the WWF, the CEO Water Mandate. In Australia, we've got partnerships with Landcare and our country road businesses around sourcing Australian grown cotton, but ensuring that soil health is protected, farming is done in an environmentally and biodiversity friendly manner, and so on. So the approach is multifaceted. The need for it is undeniable. I think from a corporate perspective, I'll end on to say that it's essentially about being able to translate these tough, sometimes nebulous concepts into languages that business understand, so that you can implement actionable initiatives in order to address them and ensure that they get embedded in the true value creation model of an organization. It can't be something you do in parallel to the business. It has to be how you do your business. I think I'll leave that as my remarks on this point, Justin.
Thanks, Rose. Thanks for the great input. I think some really good points around the importance of partnerships in this space and the interconnectedness of climate and biodiversity as well. We're going to just try and jump back to Francis Ogwal for his inputs as well. Francis, as introduced earlier, is co-chair of the CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So really hopeful we can hear some wise words from him now as well. Francis, if you don't mind joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe Gabby could display for me my presentation on screen there. Sorry, I'm having issues with my laptop, and it has just let me down, but I'll use now my handset here.
We can see your slides, thanks.
Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. So I think we've already heard from previous speakers talking about really the importance of the private sector in terms of what it does and how it impacts on the environment and what they want to do about it. All I can say is that we are not going to see economic development slowing down in the world. It's going to continue, and governments definitely need to pursue that, because that is where they provide services to their citizens. But as you all know, that the private sector then has got a very big role it plays in that. It will harness natural resources, including biodiversity, of course. And in the process, it creates jobs, it creates wealth, it improves livelihoods. So the private sector has that positive aspect it brings to people's lives and the economy. And in the case of Africa, we all know we are well endowed. We have a rich natural resource base, which includes, of course, biodiversity. And we all know that biodiversity provides those ecosystem services that actually underpins much of the services needed for the private sector to operate. So what we all know at the moment, and we can see it, is that utilization of these natural resources is not sustainable for the most part. So the emphasis you'll find that is more on extraction, but perhaps less on sustainable use or conservation. Now, in the nature positive economy, all what we are trying to say here is that we should be able to enhance the resilience of the planet and society so that we halt loss of biodiversity, even where possible, reverse that. What we all know is that Africa is not unique. It's undergoing challenges on biodiversity conservation. The biodiversity is declining in Africa, also globally. So the challenge of the post-2020, therefore, is to really take urgent action across society, including business, to conserve, sustainably use, ensure that the benefits arising from those utilizations are shared equitably, but also to put biodiversity on a path to recovery. You've had a colleague talking about how biodiversity loss is happening. Now, in the post-2020, that is what we want to set ourselves to do. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is, you could call it the irony of how things are happening in the world. We have got this vision 2050, where we are saying we need to live with the harmony with the nature. We need to be doing things better by 2050. But if you check what is happening right now, is that biodiversity is in a decline. Species, ecosystem, name it, everything is on the decline. So under scenario A, that is where you would say we would slightly see that we are still going to go see more loss even beyond 2020, which we have already passed, and then perhaps bend the curve a little bit and get back to where we are just at where the loss is not there. We are more or less even from there, and then begin seeing a positive change. That is the bending the curve. That is scenario one. But scenario B is the worst case scenario, that if nothing happens soon better, then we could even see more loss happening. And therefore, that means even living in harmony with the nature by 2050 could still be a challenge. So that is the dotted line. This graph just summarizes for you what is happening. And I think business has got a lot it should be concerned about with this trend, because as a colleague said earlier, loss of biodiversity will undermine business in many ways. Let's go to the next slide. So there are some potential areas we see that business could contribute to. Of course, conservation is part of it. But for a long time, I think we've seen that the financial resources that comes from business for conservation, when it comes to biodiversity, it is not yet well tapped, for sure. For much as we see that in climate change, the private sector seems to be really making a case there, but for biodiversity, there's a challenge. So if you look at goal D on resource mobilization, we are talking here that the gap between available financial resources now and other means of implementation and those necessary to achieve the 2050 vision should be closed by 2050. That is, we shouldn't be saying there is still a financing gap. We should be making progress to close that gap. So the private sector definitely can contribute to that. And we have those milestones, D1, D2, D3, but all of it, when you look at D1, we are talking about a resource envelope of $700 billion per year by 2030. That is something that will need a lot of effort. And then in milestone D2, here we are saying that all those other means of implementation, capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation, all those should be in place by 2030. But also most importantly, the last one, D2, this year, D3, we are saying that by 2030, the resources that we need to implement this framework between 2030 and 2040 should have been mobilized and in place. So you see, this is how the private sector could try to see how it becomes relevant for us to do conservation work. Next slide. So this is what I was talking about, bridging that gap, that financing gap. It shouldn't be widening. We should be seeing it narrowing so that by 2050, we are not talking about any more gap in financing, that whatever we need to conserve biodiversity has been mobilized. And that, again, as most of you know, the text, most likely the text that will come from COP 15 will be that resources should be mobilized from all sources. All sources would mean business should be there, private sector, governments, name them. Next slide. So I think this would be my concluding remarks, because we only have 5 minutes. I wouldn't like to take a lot of it, but I would like to draw your attention as the business on target 15. This is the one for the first time in the history of the convention that there's a target that talks specifically to the private sector, to business. Previously, it was not there. But because of the engagement we have had during this process of development post-2020, so there's that specific target that talks to the private sector of business. And here, it is mainly emphasizing that the business, including both public and private, should actually assess and report on their dependency and impact on the biodiversity, and also tell us really what they're doing to reduce those risks that could, come from their work or their effort or their intervention in harnessing biodiversity for purpose of making, life better on this planet. And then target 18, this is about subsidies. What do we do about them? Close to 500 billion per year needs to be repurposed because they are not doing meaningful work when it comes to conservation. So out of the 700 I was telling you earlier in goal D, you will find that this is one part we are talking about, that there's $500 million locked up there in negative subsidies. And we need to be seeing how that could be turned into a positive part for biodiversity. Then 19, this is where now, as I told you, the language I was telling you earlier, that increase financial resources from all sources to at least 200 billion per year. Is there a role, is there some contribution that come from business, including those additional and effective financial resources that we need? And also here, there's a provision that at least $10 billion per year of international financial flows, including, this is from, of course, developed countries, but including from the private finance, should be going to developing countries. So you can see the effort there. Private finance, again stated here. You have got private finance appearing in goal 18. You have private sector or business appearing in target 15. So target 15, 18, 19, all this has got that very direct contribution to what the private sector or business could do. So lastly, I would like just to say that the business community has got a role it can play in resource mobilization for implementing the framework. This framework, if we don't mobilize resources, it will be a piece of paper. After spending so many years, nobody will remember about it. So resources are needed across the board to enable us implement it. So more engagement, I think the private sector needs to do that with the governments so that we unlock those opportunities that are available from business to contribute towards the financial resources that we very much need to implementing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So ladies and gentlemen, I only had 5 minutes. I could have taken slightly more, but let me end there. If there are questions, I will be responding to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis. You set the scene perfectly, and we're certainly going to explore some of the financing challenges as well as dealing with subsidies in the next sessions. I think we're going to just shift on a little bit more to the role of business, though. And as you said, it is such a critical involvement space for business. So I'd like to invite Michael Cohen, who's the Environment and Climate Change Manager for Safaricom, one of the largest telecoms organizations in Africa, just to share a little bit of their journey and their commitments as well. Good day, Michael.
Thank you, Justine, for the opportunity, and thank you again, everyone. I think just picking up from where Francis left about resources required, about the role of businesses. I'd like to talk a bit about the post-2020 framework on biodiversity. And I would say the science is clear. We now have a collective responsibility, a duty to reverse the loss of biodiversity before the end of the decade. This means that by 2030, as a business, we need to have transformed our practices to become nature positive. And this is not only, a moral obligation. It's also an economic. There's also an economic imperative, as each and every business, as we've heard Francis say, actually relies on nature to prosper. Businesses need government to provide direction, at least at the highest political level, to set the direction for business actions on nature. We've seen from the recently ended COP26 in Glasgow how the collective goal of 1.5 degrees C and having our emissions by 2030 is efficient in generating momentum and triggering actions throughout our society. We still have we are still missing this common goal in the nature agenda, so to say. And we need to a clear global goal to encourage the uptake and nature positive business models and orient investments, as Francis has talked about, and business decision-making processes around nature positive outcomes. The mission of the framework is the opportunity to set this global goal for all the actors to act. To generate momentum, we need clear, simple, and enthralling mission, which would then help in encouraging many actors beyond, biodiversity to be familiar with biodiversity issues, just like the way we have for the 1.5 degrees C objective that has generated actually what we've seen as what we call now the climate actions. The current proposed mission is long, and I think it's complicated, a bit confusing, and does not reflect the ambition and level needed to achieve the 2050 vision. And this is why, as businesses, as Business for Nature, we are proposing that the CBD negotiators to adopt the mission for this framework, which is in this case is to take urgent action across society to halve and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, and to achieve a nature positive world for the benefit of the planet and the people. We've had more than 1,000 companies now, Safaricom, our Safaricom included, who have signed to the Nature is Everyone's Business call for action in supporting this ambition to reverse nature loss by the year 2030. I think such clear and strong mission will help simplify the nature agenda, guide investment decisions, as I've said, and ultimately provide direction for all of us, including our supply chain. And I think that's my submission. Back to you, Justin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. We need these kind of commitments from leading corporates across the continent. So really great to hear the kind of partnerships and collaboration that you've been driving. Our third corporate voice in this particular section is another Business for Nature signatory. So I'd just like to invite Shengiwe and Lovu from SAPI to share a little bit about the work that they're doing in this space. And then we'll get to Gabby Tarrant, who's just going to tie this together with the broader research around the business community that EWT has been involved in. Hi, Shengiwe, great to hear from you.
Hi, Justin. Thank you for having me today on this webinar. We're quite honored to be here. I'll share briefly about our ongoing actions as SAPI to try and address biodiversity, as we are in the unique position of being a large landholder within South Africa. So this leaves us with quite a big responsibility. I'm not sure how you are seeing my slides.
Seeing your notes and your next slide at the moment, so maybe go to full screen if you don't mind, Shengiwe.
Sure. Let me do that. I think it's taking me back here. So what I'll do is I'll do that.
Fine, carry on from there. Cool.
Yeah, we will try and be ingenious with this. There we go. Thanks. So our journey with biodiversity and sustainability in general is not something that is new. We have been long certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, more than 20 years now. And more recently, we became the first forestry company in South Africa to be certified by the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification, another international body recognizing sustainable forest management. Over and above that, we have committed to a total of 9 SDGs that we are actively working towards. But for this conversation, I thought these 2 would be of particular interest around climate action and life on land. So to do this and to really hone in on what we are trying to achieve, we are really focusing on taking action on the ground. That is the big message that we are pushing out as a business, and something that we have committed to. In that, within our Thrive 2025 strategy, as SAPI, we have committed to improving biodiversity on our own land holdings by 10% by 2025. 10% might sound small, but our conservation areas constitute 33% of our land, and this amounts to around 150,000 hectares of conservation land that we are currently looking after. Over and above that, we have 7 declared nature reserves within KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga that we are also actively managing for biodiversity and enhancement, and pursuing more areas. We have identified a further 2 sites that we are currently surveying and looking to declare as nature reserves. The importance of this for us as a business is that this safeguards nature in these areas in perpetuity from both other activities. If, for example, in Mpumalanga, we face a lot of pressure with mining applications. So if we can declare these areas as nature reserves, we are able to protect these areas against some of those pressures. Our biodiversity framework really has focused on 5 areas. The first is business integration. We are in the business of nature, the business of growing trees. So it is critical for us to have biodiversity as part and parcel of that and in the approach of how we work. So we have publicly committed to safeguarding biodiversity and enhancing biodiversity values on our land. We have a strategy that is guiding us on what actions we need to be taking on the ground. We have set ourselves targets, aligning with the SDGs as well as national targets, and we are ensuring we have capacity to do this by both making available human resources, but also financial resources to implement the actions that are required on the ground. Further to that, we have undertaken a biodiversity risk assessment across our land holdings to really identify the high impact areas and what management actions are required to address those issues, which we have then put together the SMART targets and mitigations for those areas. To put this into context, we have 22 estates across South Africa that make up around 350,000 hectares or so. And on each of those 22 estates, we have identified at least 2 biodiversity enhancement projects to be implemented per estate. We also have a monitoring and evaluation framework because we want to understand the impact that we're having as well as the improvements that we are making. But further than that, we are not only monitoring and evaluating what is actually happening on the ground, we have embedded biodiversity within the key performance areas of our management. So it makes it directly personal and relevant to our management structures to ensure that we are pursuing this. We are also, of course, reporting on this through our corporate sustainability reports, but also through various disclosure projects. We have recently been part of the first textile exchange biodiversity assessment. Part of our biggest clientele is within the textile industry, so we have participated in that as a raw material supplier for that. So really, I think what I want to emphasize, and with the theme around making resources available for this, is that we have started. You know, we are doing this, and we really are taking action on the ground. And we are calling on all other business to do the same, to partner. We also have a partnership with WWF on water stewardship, which we are hoping to grow even further. So all of these things are a testament to our commitment, that we are not just all talk, but we are walking the walk as an organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ngiwe. I think it really is heartening to see the collaboration from not only SAPI, but also Mondi and some of the other key forestry organizations in understanding biodiversity impact. So I know there's a couple of questions for you in the Q&A already, if you don't mind having a look, and I'll answer some in a sec as well. The speaker in this particular section is Dr. Gabby Tarrant from the Endangered Wildlife Trust. She's not only the kind of co-organizer and the, I guess, co-holder of the Business for Nature work in South Africa, but also has been driving the National Business and Biodiversity Network. So really looking forward, Gabby, to hearing some of the assessment feedback for the latest year.
Thanks, Justin. I'm just going to share my screen and show a couple of slides. And yeah, I think it's really timely that I've come after these couple of presenters, because what we've done as part of the National Biodiversity and Business Network is formed the Biodiversity Disclosure Project, in which we assess the mainstreaming of companies across Africa in a standardized and scientific way, which I think has been badly needed. A lot of companies are putting really good work into things, and a lot of companies have really good policies, but we've really wanted to assess the performance as a whole along the biodiversity mainstreaming journey. And this directly relates to the 2020 framework, which, as Tidrick pointed out, target 15 is really targeting all businesses to assess and report on their dependencies and impacts on biodiversity. So this report directly relates to how well South Africa is doing towards that. We're actually releasing the report tonight. It's going to be publicly available on our website. And it's the third annual rating. So what's really great is we can see and track the improvements and performance of companies from 2018. We actually assessed all 327 JSE listed companies and 27 state-owned enterprises. And what I think is the big take-home message here, which is quite startling, is that only 79 of these companies, so less than 25%, less than a quarter, actually recognize biodiversity as a material issue. And that needs to really be understood and unpacked. I think biodiversity has remained long off of the agenda following climate change, and it's now trying to rapidly catch up. But the report really speaks for itself. What we did in the assessment was asked a series of 8 questions, which you can see in the slide here. And they relate from the very basics of whether a company has a biodiversity policy to do they measure their impacts and dependencies? Do they have action plans in place, and how good are those action plans? And then actually whether they disclose their biodiversity risks and performance. Each of these questions had a maximum score of 4, and the methodology is available in our report. And you can see there has been slightly improved average scores for each of the questions. However, every single question has an average score of less than 1 out of 4, which is quite startling. Question 1 and 2, so the very basics of policies and dependencies and impacts and just recognizing biodiversity, were the highest scored for the JSE listed companies. And question 6, in terms of biodiversity action plan, interestingly, was the highest scored for state-owned enterprises. So we're very carefully tracking these different companies and where they are in their journey of biodiversity mainstreaming. And it's always good to point out the champions, many of which you will have already heard from today and will hear from later. You can look up the score of any company listed on the JSE and state-owned enterprises on the website from tonight. There's the QR code, which will take you to that list. And if we have a look firstly at the industries, I think no surprise that basic materials, so mining, forestry, were the ones most engaged with biodiversity. Over half of them recognized biodiversity as a material impact, and we're quite far down their mainstreaming journey. And what is quite staggering, though, is that the financials, so 63 companies, which represents quite a big share of the JSE, had the lowest performing scores when it came to biodiversity. And if we're talking about financing biodiversity and creating incentives for positive biodiversity, this is incredibly important and key to show that we're still behind, we're still lagging behind. I've given a kind of a list there of the top 10 companies, several of which are chatting to today, and that really shows commitment to having a look at biodiversity, even though we're quite far behind in general in mainstreaming, in terms of having action plans in place, disclosing those plans, having KPIs, having smart targets. All of these things is language that the business world needs to start using when talking about biodiversity. But I think we are showing some improvements. We have a long way to go, and really companies can do better, and they should be doing better. And hopefully this webinar is a bit of a momentum as well to show how companies can engage. And we do need the post-2020 framework to really kick in and help support African businesses. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks very much, Gabby. That's a brilliant perspective. I guess in a company like South Africa, where we're one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, it's quite worrying that we haven't seen a bigger level of commitment and integration of biodiversity issues. So definitely a lot of work to be done, not only here, but I guess across the continent as well. Maybe Gabby, a quick guidance from you, whether we have time for 1 or 2 questions for the panel, or whether we should be shifting to the next session.
I think we should be shifting to the next session, but as the Q&A is open, hopefully panelists can type in answers to everyone there. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Justin. And if we can now turn to Michael, if you can turn on your video. And
hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Corinne, and thanks, Justin, for hosting that very interesting first panel. I think it was very summary and encouraging in the sense that, you know, hearing from companies like Woolworths and SAPI around concrete actions that they're already taking to address climate, nature, and the biodiversity space is really encouraging. But then I think the summary that Gabby also shared at the end really showcases how much further that we have to go and how much more businesses can do to really bridge the gap if we already have around 79 out of 354 companies saying that, you know, biodiversity is material to their companies. Yeah, so I think setting the scene, we have seen from the first panel that businesses depend on a healthy planet to provide, you know, the services, deal with customers for their workforces and the natural resources necessary for production. the Dasgupta review, which was published earlier in review, emphasized the need for transformational change and the acceptance of the simple truth that companies exist within and are dependent on the natural world. So I think similar to what Michael was saying earlier, the science is very clear. We've seen examples of businesses that are taking action, but they cannot do that alone. So businesses and governments must work together to transform our economic and financial systems. In Business for Nature, we've been working with a wide range of stakeholders and businesses, and our call to action, which Michael again alluded to, has galvanized over 1,000 companies with a combined revenue of around 4.7 trillion, urging governments to adopt policies now to reverse nature loss. So this gives us a really good opportunity with the upcoming CBD COP15, which provides the platform for the globe or the world to adopt an ambitious and effective framework that will significantly accelerate and transform our economic and financial systems. This Global Biodiversity Framework has the potential to help not only scale, but also drive the action at a speed that is required, and also to provide the investments needed from the private sector to create sustainable growth, to generate clean jobs, and potentially unlock the trillions in economic opportunities, as Francis also alluded to in his submission. At Business for Nature, we've been working very closely with the CBD by providing inputs, and we've actually welcomed a lot of the improvements in the first draft, which included the recognition of the role of business, and I think Francis also alluded to that. However, moving forward, and as we have time to sort of refine the framework going into COP, there still are some elements that need to be strengthened, that we think can be improved. And we remain concerned a little bit that the overall ambition and the sense of urgency might not be where it needs to be to really drive action to reverse nature loss by 2030. We're obviously really disappointed that the next negotiations, which were supposed to take place in Geneva in January, is being cancelled and postponed. But obviously we know that that's for the right reasons. The health and safety of all delegates comes first, and it's important to make sure that all parts of the negotiating teams are available to participate. So with that scene setting, I think we've already heard from Michael earlier around the need for governments to adopt a clear, simple, and rallying mission for post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to have a common goal to start driving action. But we will hear from three other speakers. I will hear from Jean-Michel Ponce, who is the CEO of Wholesome Uganda. And I will start with you first, Michel. So in September this year, Wholesome really launched its nature positive biodiversity strategy, which makes it one of the first companies within the construction sector to commit to very concrete, measurable, sort of positive impact on biodiversity with transformative rehabilitation plans. Now, the current post-2020 framework includes the target to eliminate and redirect environmentally harmful subsidies, as was highlighted initially by Francis. For Wholesome, I just want to find out, why is this essential for companies like yours to be able to reach your targets and accelerate the action that you've set on in your strategy?
So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you hear me well, properly.
Yes, we can hear you, Michel.
Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be with all of you and to represent Wholesome Group. So as you mentioned, I'm the CEO of Wholesome in Uganda, and this is biodiversity and environment, I would say, is really core value for all individuals. It's not only about companies or certain organizations. We are all focusing on that target, and our company is really involved into it. And it's not only like discussion we have in certain meetings. It's we have defined commitments, so measurables. So I think that's something very important to share with all of you. And this has been defined with International Union for Conservation of Nature. So we don't do it on our side, and it's something that is linked with with people around us, because we work in interaction with all of us. So I think it's very important that we have this kind of targets. So for 2030, and we implement today. We don't wait 2030. And if we can reach those objectives in terms of biodiversity and environment earlier than that has been defined, it's much better for all of us, and not only for companies. So what does it mean, this commitment of Holcim Group? There are different, I could articulate this into, let's say, 3 different topics. We could see that in the kind of solution we promote and we provide to, I would say, to the market, solutions that are better for the environment. I'm talking about concrete solutions that are, we call them hydromedia, so that we have a better flow of water. It's going directly into the soil. This is on the I would say on the top line, on the commercial aspect. We are also pushing a lot into waste management, and waste management is really core into our activity. So Holcim has different, let's say, business line. I will talk about one particularly in Uganda that we have is the cement industry in the construction business, and the way we articulate that with the environment, and this is done with our division Geocycle. Let me be clear on that one, is how can we source differently, and how can we develop the environment around us. So there are there are some resources like coal or pet coke that we source from very far. When we have around us farmers in our country, in Uganda, we have farmers around us. How can we help each other? So it's not only for the one community or one type of company, it's how we can work together. That's very important. So what can we get, what kind of value we can have discussing with farmers around us? We have started with them in 2002. So we talk now about 2030, but we started in 2002 getting from them the waste. So today we have around in the energy consumption we need in order to produce construction solution, we need 65% of I would say source of energy coming from agriculture, from farmers that are around us. So that's really a massive change, and this is just for everybody to understand. We are the number 3 worldwide in terms of utilization of this green energy that are around us. So we are operating about 80 countries worldwide, and we are giving sometimes advice with other countries, like Uganda, are helping other countries worldwide. How do we do with our farmers? How can we develop and go further? So we are at 65% of our energy that are non-fossil energy, and it's also waste coming from agriculture. It can be coffee husk and that kind of a source of energy, and it can also be collection of other waste. We could talk about the used oil, for instance, and other kind of tires can be used tires can be a source of energy. So this is something really great, and we need to go further. But how can we go further? I think what is important is to have a proper legal framework in order to channel the waste. This is something that we are, I would say, we are initiating, and if we want to go a step further, we need to align ourselves. So how can we discuss better with FMCG, with the fuel station, tank station, oil and gas company, to get the waste and to be able and to be recognized. Okay, we produce cement, but we are also producing solution to clean our environment. And I think it's really important that we work close to each other, and maybe we help the regulation to move on and to help this collection when there is a possibility to use it, so it can be we can reuse the material. That's even better. But when it has to be disposed, maybe it can be used as a source of energy. So that's something I wanted to share. And maybe the last aspect I wanted to touch also is inside our operations. How can we be cleaner, and so that we are really careful about environment. And I will give you an example how careful we are. It's in Kenya, where our old quarry, we had we used the reserve that was in this environment, and we gave it back to the nature, I would say. We have now a natural park with animal and very diverse environment, I would say, in our operation. So those are the three things I wanted to mention to you, and I will be very happy to get additional question, if any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel Pons, for that very comprehensive answer around your strategy. I think it's really interesting to see that at the base of this is a lot of stakeholder collaborations, and that you mentioned, you're thinking about the local farmers, you're thinking about your entire ecosystems, how you're working not only within the construction supply chain, but working with oil and gas and other sectors to make sure that your full strategy comes to fruition. So thank you very much for that, and we'll see if we still have time for any additional questions. But I will very swiftly transition to our next speaker, Mr. Warwick Mostert, who's the Principal Biodiversity at Anglo American. So I think the role of TCFD was actually mentioned in, or TNFD was mentioned in the first panel by Feroz. And Warwick is a task force member of the TNFD, which is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, for those on the call who have never heard about this. And the task force aims to develop a risk management and disclosure framework for businesses to report and act on nature-related risks, which ultimately will aim to support shifts away from global financial flows that support nature negative outcomes. So I think the question to you, Mr. Warwick, is why is this important on how the draft 1 of the post-2020 biodiversity framework is strengthened to support this objective?
Thanks, Michael. And so in the interest of time, I'll try and keep it as brief as possible so we can get to the discussion. I think, one of the reasons that we joined the task force was really to get involved. And I think we've heard this call is to say, what more can business do to get involved? And it really is a call to action. So we supported the Business for Nature call. And we just think if you want to be part of the conversation, joining, where you can is obviously critical. So we joined the task force. But I guess the question is to say, well, how can it be aligned in terms of what we want out of the Global Biodiversity Framework? It very much is, the objective is to deliver a risk management framework that's looking at the dependencies of a company on nature-related risks. Importantly, there is a linkage there, obviously, with climate-related risks, and learning from the TCFD, as you said. How is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures going to be different? The way that we've seen it, they very much complement each other. It's absolutely critical that we build on the lessons learned from the TCFD, and there've been a couple of hard lessons learned in that as well. The really difficult part, and I think everybody will agree, is how we don't have a metric as easy as we've had for climate change and for example, for emissions. So we don't have that, and that's something that we've got to work on. And so this reporting framework has got a very, very strong focus on metrics. And importantly, the objective is not to go and come up with anything new, and it's to look for where there's complementarity in terms of some of the other work. So to get to your point around the Global Biodiversity Framework, I think there's clearly a strong message which has been put through in Target 15. I think, you know, we looked at it, and together with Business for Nature, it does need to be strengthened. There absolutely is that call to say, yes, there is a call for companies to reduce their negative impacts, but what about positive? And it talks about positive, but are probably not enough. What we've seen coming out of a lot of companies, and it's really encouraging to hear the commitments, you know, from the likes of Wholesome as well around nature positive. I think there's probably an opportunity to get an understanding of what we mean by nature positive. What are those nature positive commitments that are site-based? And so the way that we've looked at it is that's very much around either a net gain or a no net loss commitment, things that you can control within a company's you know, fence and boundary. And I know Joel will probably ask as well as to say, how are we addressing our sort of downstream and supply chain impacts? And that's an absolutely critical step. And I think that's where the nature positive piece comes in, is that it's those elements outside of our footprint and outside of our, sorry, just a helicopter flying past, outside of our boundaries that become nature positive. So the way that we've approached it is that nature positive at a group and at a corporate level, addressing some of these landscape initiatives is obviously critical. And what is the call? The important thing is to engage with the Global Biodiversity Framework, strengthen the call for businesses to get involved, align it with the reporting framework and metrics like is going to be developed through the TNFD. The plan is to have a beta framework of the TNFD launched next year. And the whole idea is to make sure that we can get it tested to see whether it is working. And really the call is for businesses and for anybody who is interested is join the panel. There's a forum as well in terms of other members and really be part of the development of this, because it's really critical that we get this alignment between this reporting framework and others. And we know the Science-Based Network, you know, has got a framework. We know that there are other, for example, the Capitals Coalition. And so really, you know, we see the TNFD as very much complementary to that. And importantly, obviously, giving the input into the COP20, the Global Biodiversity Framework. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much, Warwick, for that succinct but yet impactful intervention. And I think the point that I take away from this is around making sure that, you know, the outcome of the TNFD is very much aligned with other frameworks and other reporting frameworks that are also out there. But specifically for the CBD framework, I think there's a strong call to strengthen that need for disclosure. And I think the TNFD has a really interesting role to play. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
So I will now swiftly turn on to the next speaker, Simon Lefrink, who is Water and Health Biodiversity Specialist at Sibanye-Stillwater. And really interesting, just a quick note, while we were in the plenary call, I think Simon's last name actually one that resonates very well within the industry, in the sense that Sibanye-Stillwater is one of the world's largest primary producer of platinum, second largest producer of palladium, and the third largest producer of gold. So really an industry giant. Simon, the extractive industry is perhaps one of the, you know, high direct impact industry on biodiversity, but also one of the industries that depends a lot on nature and natural resources. So it'll be really interesting to hear from you as well, just to close the loop on this conversation, how your company is, you know, approaching the issue of tackling biodiversity halting and also trying to reverse nature loss.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael. Very excited to be here. And I think we're a good company to demonstrate this. We're relatively young as compared to most of the other companies, and therefore also quite new in our biodiversity journey. However, I do feel we've made some very big strides in the last year or so, and we're definitely moving in the right direction. So I hope to share some of the more practical examples, more practical context around embedding biodiversity into a business. Some of these have already been mentioned, and hopefully I can just expand on them a little bit. So I think first and foremost, it's been mentioned before, just the definition around biodiversity is quite often debated around. People either don't quite understand what it means. It's, oh, that pretty species over there. And that was something we really needed to arrive at as a business to understand and have a complete picture of what biodiversity means, which to us is the abiotic, so the non-living factors, the biotic, the living factors, how they interact with one another. And we see globally there's also a move towards saying, you know, nature instead of biodiversity. For us, that's a synonym. And we just want to state very clearly that historically nature has excluded humans from the equation. We can't be excluded, we're part of it, and we can only manage nature or biodiversity successfully if we look at it as an integrated unit. Further to that, as has been previously mentioned, climate change and biodiversity are interrelated, and it's very essential to understand that this comes from two main components. The first is, of course, the sequestration, which is quite a complex matter to actually quantify. And the second is the resilience. I think we need to realize, unfortunately, that we are not meeting our climate change objectives as a globe. And therefore, we are going to see changes. These changes are going to have an impact on our businesses. They're going to have an impact on our communities and even our post-mining uses. So it's essential that we protect ecosystems so that they're also resilient to these changes that are going to occur. So now that we've arrived at our definitions and the understanding behind why we're protecting biodiversity and moving it forward, the company also made the decision to appoint a specialist, which is myself. So the portfolio actually didn't exist up until recently. It was one that was embedded into, say, compliance or part of carbon at that point in time. So we've had a very specific focus and drive from a biodiversity perspective. My other side of my title is water health, and that really speaks to ecosystem protection for downstream water users, which includes, of course, the aquatic ecosystem, and catchments capture everything. So this is why that biodiversity and water health is so interrelated. Then we come to something that we're very excited about. We found, and it came out really in the earlier speakers' conversation around the fact that many companies are still struggling with those quantification of biodiversity assets, the changes over time. How do you report on them? I mean, we've had very bulky, very long standalone reports in terms of biodiversity management plans. And we just didn't find that these were integrating into our business. They sat on a shelf somewhere and were every now and then dusted off just for compliance purposes and not really embedded. And it was very difficult to disclose on them. How do you disclose on a 500-page odd document per mine? Most people don't even understand 90% of that context. So this is when we got very excited to be approached by the Endangered Wildlife Trust to participate in the review of the National Business and Biodiversity's Biological Diversity Protocol. And they've actually come up with an excellent metric that we're very excited to be reporting on in our 2021 annual report, which will be released next year, around the hectare equivalents and changes over time. And the wonderful thing about this is that it uses our existing data. So it uses that science-based data that we've been generating for years now, and puts it into a format that we can actively track and manage moving forward and report to our stakeholders. So yeah, very excited to be part of that process. Finally, essential for, I think, all mining operations and probably any process is a procedure. So we've taken all of this, put it down into a procedure, and again, this procedure aims to not be standalone. We want to make sure that each and every single action is embedded into the business from start to finish, so that that mitigation hierarchy is applied from pre-feasibility stages to post-mining. Because if you end just at mining, that sustainability or that biodiversity protection that you've put in place isn't going to last. Further to that, we also look at it, of course, from a site-based assessment or even a project-based assessment all the way up into our corporate world. So there's various levels to this, and it's making sure that it's integrated throughout. And as part of this procedure, we've developed something called an option analysis. And this option analysis really aims to say, okay, we want to develop something for the betterment of the company, for the betterment of the community, but how do we do it in a biodiversity positive or a nature positive way? And this is where the mitigation hierarchy comes to play. So from that very beginning, and we've had a lot of debates about this for even the smallest of pipeline routes that we've put in place, to say, listen, but can't we rather put it here or move it there, and view this from all different aspects, including security, community requirements, safety and security and health, so that we know that whatever we're implementing is going to again be sustainable and doesn't need to be changed in the future. So I hope that's given some context from our side. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much. I think that was also a very, succinct, very detailed sort of framework around how you have taken the whole journey towards nature positivity, and it's really interesting to hear how you've done the assessment, understanding your impact and the dependencies on nature, but also how you've integrated it, the whole process within different parts of the company at project ecosystem level as well. I think this was a really insightful panel, and I'm getting a signal from the organizers that this is all what the time that we have left. So unfortunately, we would have to keep this short here before we move to the next session. I'm happy to hand over back to you, the organizers, so that we can move on to the next session. Thank you so much.
Hi, Candice, can you take over for the next panel, please?
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for that fantastic session. My name is Candice Stevens, and I have the privilege of chairing Africa's Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition in partnership with WWF. I head up innovative finance and policy for Wilderness Foundation Africa, and my passion is being able to create innovative financial solutions so that we can address both our climate and biodiversity crises. We have a very exciting panel that is going to be talking about some of the innovative finance solutions that are available to us, and importantly, what business can do for nature in terms of sustainable finance. So there's been so much discussion around the importance of building biodiversity into the corporate sector, different businesses, different business models, and the reporting. But we also have to ask ourselves the question, when we're looking at the targets for biodiversity, and we need to be able to effectively address those on the ground and ensure implementation, money is required in order to do that. And we sit with substantial financial gaps in implementation in addressing the biodiversity targets. And we need to push the boundaries in terms of how the business sector comes in to be able to support on the ground implementation of biodiversity solutions, as well as being part and parcel of the innovation required to create new sources of finance, new finance pipelines, and new innovative financial mechanisms to begin addressing the reality on the ground in being able to apply practical solutions across our landscapes. And so I'm going to hand over to our very first speaker, Madeleine Ronquest, who's the group head for environmental, social and climate risk at First Rand. Madeleine, it's fantastic to have you on board and to continue the ongoing conversation and importance of the private sector and commercial entities in being able to address the biodiversity crisis. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Candice. And just to start out with, cry our beloved country. Not only do we have a biodiversity crisis, but I have a power outage at the moment. So I would love to make you think that it's the buzz of bees or beetles, but it's actually the buzz of a generator. But I hope that I could stay connected. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I will keep it very short and sweet. I think up to very recently, people really wondered what the role of a finance institution would be in anything environmental. But I am an environmental scientist and conservationist, and I've been with the group for 20 years. And we've actually been working on these aspects for a very long time. And I'm very interested to hear what all the companies have been saying up to now, because we have a vested interest in what we finance. And I recognize many of our clients on these panels. And for us, it's really important that our clients take this seriously and that they look at biodiversity with a whole different lens than before. And we know, and I could see from the discussions, that some Some companies have progressed far further than others, and this is such a valuable opportunity for us to learn from those who have gone before us. As a finance institution, for what we've been doing for a very long time is doing negative screening, so making sure that we don't enable destruction of biodiversity and ecosystems by managing, by applying legislation, by making sure that whatever our clients do will not have a significant negative impact on the environment. And I think we've been somewhat successful. And unfortunately, if we look at species decline and human, because of human intervention, I don't think that we've had quite the success that we hoped for. But so the part on risk management is a definitive. I think that is what we've been doing for a very long time. If anything, we are becoming stricter. We are pricing externalities. We are making sure that capital flows in the direction of climate change, adaptation and mitigation, but also biodiversity and shared prosperity. So there's a very significant social element to all of the work that we do. Because it's all interconnected, which I'm sure many of the panelists have mentioned before. So for us, it's an absolute incentive to understand how to quantify, how to measure, which are the sectors that we need to focus on most. And we're doing significant work in agriculture, for instance, because that is very closely linked to food security. So sustainable agriculture would be one of the major outputs. We're also looking at textiles. We're looking at tourism because that is significantly and very closely linked to biodiversity and ecosystems. And then obviously the power sector, which is very integrated with climate risk as well. It's very difficult to look at these from two different perspectives because there is such an interlink. And so food security, beverages, so the retail space and so on are just one of our first thoughts. And what we are doing now is actually raising awareness about dependencies as well. So we've been very good at managing impacts, I think. And we're now looking at dependencies. And I think companies don't necessarily attach a value to biodiversity or natural capital that they use in their processes. I don't even think that they spare a thought for that unless they are one of the leading companies that we've heard of on this panel. So we want to spend a lot of time initially raising awareness, making people understand how important natural capital is in their manufacturing processes and for the delivery of their product, but also at the same time talk about life cycle assessment, circular economy, repurposing, not wasting, being more efficient. So for us, it's a whole ecosystem, sorry for the word, but it just fits in quite nicely, of all the bits and pieces that fit into the economy. And so we have teams of people who are now looking at not just climate mitigation and adaptation, but also producing product that is closely linked to adaptation. So it could be rain harvesting, or sustainable agriculture, like I've mentioned before, because we have a very specific passion for adaptation. And I don't think that there's enough focus on that. It's not just me that thinks that. At COP26, that was one of the major outcomes, that there's not enough focus, there's not enough financing for adaptation, and therefore we have to seriously consider it. And then other products that relate to biodiversity as well. And I think that companies that can provide a portfolio of evidence like the ones that we've seen here will definitely have a more favorable position when they apply for credit. The other thing, just from the TNFD perspective, I think Warwick and I are the only representatives from Africa and the African continent on that task force. And I think the work that we are doing there is really, really important, especially when looking at financing across different sectors and how the TNFD is going to interplay with the TCFD, but also take in its own position of importance in the global markets.
Madeleine, thank you so much. It's fantastic to get the perspective from the financial institution at First Rand, and we're going to move across now to get the perspective of investment firms. Caroline, if I can hand over to you, we're a bit short on time, so I'm going to move very quickly on to your perspectives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be with you. I'll just give you a brief background of our firm. We are Okavango Capital Partners, and we invest in the private equity sector. We invest in businesses that have a positive impact on nature, climate, and also on rural livelihoods. And we have professionals in private equity, in conservation, and in impact backgrounds. So our main approach to investing is basically on the fund strategy that we have is on our inputs, which is the capital. So the capital that we bring in, the expertise we bring in by our conservation specialists and our impact specialists, and the data as well. We do have a program whereby we want to make decisions based on data. So what we are doing is that we are going to put into the nature-linked sectors. One of them is sustainable agriculture. The other one is catalytic technologies and the natural capital services. So that's how we are looking at the sectors, and we are looking to actually invest in companies that are encouraging a change in behavior in terms of how their consumers interact with nature. Companies that are promoting change in behavior in the communities and the way they seek to finance their livelihoods. So mainly what we are doing is that we know that some of the products that are currently being sold in the market are based on demand. So therefore, what we are trying to do is to see how can we have a sustainable, scalable consumption. So the entities that we are looking to invest in are the ones that promote scaled consumption, that is sustainable production of in agriculture, sustainable production in the energy sector. And so we are looking to convert some of that behavior, and we will assist the companies to be able to do that. So again, the way we are looking at it is that we are looking for companies that are positioned to integrate the environment, the impact with their day-to-day business. So they rely on nature, but then again, their operations have a large footprint. So those are the kind of entities that we are looking to fund, and we are looking to then map them according to the important ecosystems and biodiversity. So once we've mapped those entities, then we see how can we leverage their operations to be able to change behavior, to be able to help the consumers and the communities around them to change behavior in terms of their consumption habits and in terms of how they look for their livelihoods on a day-to-day basis. So as financiers, we are very, very keen to invest in businesses that are inherently built on nature conservation and on the biodiversity, taking a responsibility towards the ecosystem and the biodiversity.
Caroline, thank you so much. It's fantastic to hear the role of investment specifically for nature-based businesses
Yes.
and nature-based returns.
Yes.
That really is the future, in my opinion. I'm going to hand over now to Seren Madare from WWF to share a little bit with us on the innovation side. Thanks, Seren.
Thanks, Candice. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to quickly share my screen and put that into presentation mode. So hopefully you can all see that nice and clearly. I'm from WWF, and I think Madeleine raised the point earlier of why is a bank looking at biodiversity or nature? Well, the similar questions has been asked of WWF is why is a conservation organization looking at finance? Well, WWF, we have a global finance practice, and part of our objectives there is to encourage a meaningful shift in finance to actually achieve the environmental and social goals of WWF. So using this familiar finance framework of risk and opportunity, at WWF, we believe we can work with the finance sector to use the influence to improve the integration of environmental risks in financing and lending decisions. We want to encourage the finance sector to deliver greater investment for sustainable development. And lastly, we want to use the influence of the finance sector to in turn drive sustainable practices in the real economy. Now, WWF plays a role across multiple different sustainable finance activities. Green financial solutions like collective investment scheme mutual funds like the Sunlam Living Planet Fund, the DBSA's climate finance facility that looks at green infrastructure deals, the Green Outcomes Fund and Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition, which I've highlighted here because I'm just going to touch on it in a couple more minutes. And then we also look at environmental risk tools for financial institutions, where we look at things like water tools, carbon pricing, etc. We do a lot of thought leadership from topics ranging from sustainable agriculture, electricity, to all the way up to the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and Active Ownership. We engage with corporates quite regularly via different alliances, different industry platforms, different initiatives that we're part of. We also look at finance policy, as well as looking at education, training, and awareness for asset owners, asset managers, and different stakeholders in the finance space. But I want to talk a bit more on some of our innovation that we've put together in the green financial solutions space. So the Green Outcomes Fund is a fund that we've been working on since its design phase all the way up to fundraising and now in its operational phase. It's an example of a green financial solution, and it's a first of its kind structure in South Africa. And it's a good example of an innovation in the finance space and in the impact investing market. The Green Outcomes Fund, or GOF, as we affectionately call it, provides outcome-based match funding in concessionary capital to existing and emerging local investment funds in order to promote investments in green SMMEs in South Africa by paying for green outcomes. What we aim to do is to incentivize local fund managers to use new approaches and financing models to target high potential and fast growing SMMEs that are operational in South Africa's green economy. The funding that we provide through GOF will then lead on to investments to SMMEs which not have been feasible without the catalytic funding provided by GOF. By implementing GOF, we would not be able to do it without certain partners. So the design partners were ourselves, WWF, as well as the Bertha Center from the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business, Green Cape, and catalytic funding provided by the World Bank's Climate Technology Program. In terms of outcomes we're looking to finance through GOF, there are a suite of outcomes that we are targeting. These include outcomes under energy, water, waste, sustainable agriculture, and of course around green jobs, which is our primary outcome that we're trying to fund in this first phase of Green Outcomes Fund. I really like this picture of the Green Outcomes Fund because this picture describes the structure of the fund, and in one slide you can see all the kind of elements that's coming together to provide this green financial solution to the market. We have the fund, which is registered as the trust. We have the funders, which is National Treasury's Job Fund, as well as RMB, Chikalulu, the First Land Foundation. Then we have the advisory committee and the investment committee that are part of the governance structure of the Green Outcomes Fund. I play a role on the investment committee, and my colleague from WWF plays a role on the advisory committee. And we have experts in the impact investing sphere that's sitting on the IC and the AC that's providing a governance role to the fund. Then we've partnered with fund managers in the impact investing space in South Africa. Here you can see the 4 fund managers that we've partnered, which include Ed Growth, Business Partners, Conservation International Ventures Fund, and Mergence Investment Managers. These fund managers, or catalytic finance partners as we like to call them, have a mandate to invest in SMMEs in the South African economy and invest in green SMMEs. So they have a portfolio of companies that include companies that are providing a positive impact on nature, as well as providing a profit through their business. So we issue capital or grant funding through to these through these investment managers, and they in turn issue financing or matched concessionary finance. Well, we issue the concessionary finance, and then they match that and issue finance to these green SMMEs in the portfolio. So that's a quick overview of how the Green Outcomes Fund is working. We are catalyzing new investments into green SMEs that wouldn't have been possible without the Green Outcomes Fund funding. The next innovation in finance I'm going to talk about is the Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition. The Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition was created by the Wilderness Foundation Africa and WWF. Candace Stevens, who's moderating this part of today's session, is actually the chair of the Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition. And this coalition was created to be catalytic and innovative driving force for the development of finance solutions for effective and enduring conservation in South Africa. This slide here shows the structure of our coalition. We have a steering committee on which I'm a member of and Candace chairs. Then we have a council. The council is representative of sectors, cross sectors in South Africa, where we have key stakeholders, leaders in their fields that are members of the council. So we have over 18 council members representing different sectors that are providing input, guidance to the coalition in order to help us achieve our objectives. Below that, we have an innovation hub, and this is where the magic kind of happens. Below the innovation hub, we have these, well, within the innovation hub, we have these finance solution incubators that are housed there. And here you can see some examples of these incubators, from tax investigations, offsets, to bankable projects. These incubators are meant to be think tanks where we look at ideas, put them on paper, and then take them to the next step, which is a potential feasibility study. From that feasibility study, we can get to a pilot, and from that pilot, we can scale up those solutions. So taking what could just be new thoughts and ideas all the way up to pilot projects and hopefully getting them to scale. We also have a series of pilots. Yes.
Darren.
Am I over time?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, that was
quick. Please.
Sure. Well, lastly, I wanted to say there are no silver bullets for integrating finance and environmental conservation. What we need to do is understand the context and be willing to collaborate with one another, which I think is coming out strongly through a lot of the other presentations that we've seen. And yeah, with that, I'd just like to close. And we can talk about these things for a long time, but sorry, time's up. And I will switch over to the next presenter. Thank you.
Saren, thank you so much for sharing around innovation. I'm really sorry that we didn't have enough time for this finance section. Cohen, I'm going to hand straight back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Candace, and thank you so much to all of the speakers. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear what everybody is doing. We are over time. We will run a little bit longer, but if people need to go, we're really sorry that we haven't had a full question and answer session. For me, if I look at the things that have come out, I would urge the organizers, Gabby and the Biodiversity and Business Network, to consider further dialogues and conversations. There is clearly an enormous wealth of information and new material coming through that needs to be further teased out, further understood. I think some of the most important things that came up in the question box was around the accountability mechanisms, such as they might be in the post-2020 framework. The whole issue of disclosure came up in many questions. What to disclose, how to disclose, what metrics, what the links are between TNFD and TCFD. A lot of very, very interesting questions. And so I think if we can just take it that we're now 10 minutes over time, we will try and take a few questions. Madeleine, there was one question that dealt with the link between, financial institutions and positioning this with clients, as well as then reporting the impact of a financial institution and making available finance either one way or the other, either denying finance or penalizing in terms of interest rates. In the mainstream financial markets, what do we need to do to get other banks, other financial institutions to start taking this a little bit more seriously?
Karen, yes, you're absolutely right. I think it's always dangerous to lead because you know, as soon as you become owners to one client, they're going to say, well, I'll go to the next bank. So we are trying to work through our Sustainable Finance Forum, through BASA of the Banking Association of South Africa, to make sure that everybody works off the same baseline and that everybody practices the same. We all have access to development funding from DFIs across the world, and those are very specific with outcomes based on biodiversity or sustainable finance or climate finance. And so we can all get access to that. So we all have the same benefit. We all have the opportunity to be intermediaries. And it's just to have that mind shift that it becomes an opportunity for a bank to participate in the process and to be part of the solution. If you look at the ratings report that Gabby will share tonight, I think there are 2 financial institutions on that rating, and well, us for one scored very badly because we don't habitually put everything out in the public domain, but we've learned a few lessons and we intend on progressing. And I think that could be a nice incentive for us to start disclosing more on what we're doing in terms of biodiversity.
Thanks very much. And Gabby, if I can turn to you, in terms of the linking of the biodiversity protocol and what's emerging as this need for better disclosure, more disclosure and better disclosure, where do you think we're going from here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think we really need to be speaking the same language and be able to have the same standardized metrics and measurements. Yeah. And we also need to relate biodiversity impacts that are on the ground. Not all ecosystems are created equal, and we're blessed with amazing biodiversity in this country. And if you go to, you know, any mountain in the Western Cape and you have a look at the fynbos, the diversity is incredible. And so we really need to be able to show, when we're measuring dependencies and impacts really on the ground, what that means. And I think that's what we need to push for is metrics which have reality at the core. And that will, I think, take us a long way to protecting those ecosystems and conserving them.
Thanks, Gabby. I think with that, we need to close to allow people to go back to their day jobs, because by the sounds of things, there is lots of passion and lots of energy going into some very, very important work. Once again, I want to thank the organizers. I think it's been a superb event, and I think that there is certainly call for greater depth on some of these topics. So perhaps in the next one, we try and do less breadth and more depth. But thank you very much to every speaker, and to those of you that got it cut a bit short and didn't get to the questions. We are so sorry. Your input was really, really valuable. With that, I'm going to close and thank you all.